Hi all, welcome to Lunchtime Topics, an educational program of the Creative Coast. I'm Kate, Director of Programming and Communications at the Creative Coast, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit here in Savannah that exists to cultivate the innovation economy on the coast of Georgia. And one of the ways we achieve this is through our social and educational programming, like today's Lunchtime Topic. So during Lunchtime Topics, we bring on a guest who is an expert in their industry to share their knowledge with Savannah's startup founders, innovators, creatives, and professionals. Today's guest is Kevin Lawver, and I've known Kevin for probably going on a decade now. I think I started with the Creative Coast 2013 or 2014, and he's always been super involved in the community and helped out with the Creative Coast. He's been instrumental to launching the tech community here in Savannah as the co-founder and director of a local organization called Tech Savannah, or Tech Sav for short. And they do a lot of local meetups. They have something called Tech Tuesday where you can meet up at a bar and get to know other techies in the community for one, as well as other programming they offer. So he's also a 26-year veteran. Kevin is also a 26-year veteran of the tech industry. He got his start as a programmer at AOL back when everybody was using AOL, and spent 13 years there building things like search engines and social media stuff before social media really even existed. So after that, he spent 13 years at various at startups, and today he is a software developer at Gusto, which is a remote style company that serves over 200,000 businesses nationwide through its platform that automates and simplifies their payroll, benefits, and HR, all while providing support. And as I mentioned, he's the director of TechSav, but he's also, been involved in various nonprofits serving on their boards. And for years, he's taught free coding workshops like Rails Bridge and Code Bar for people interested in learning to code. And so that's a big part of kind of what we're talking about today. Kevin is going to share his insights as to what it's like to work in the tech industry. And we'll talk about coding particularly and how to break into that career path. And we'll also touch on other options in the tech industry a bit. So welcome, Kevin. Glad to have you back. It's been a year, I think, a year or two.
Who knows? It's still 2020. We just had the third annual Groundhog Day 2020. So,
Yeah, it feels like it, right? 2021 didn't happen, actually. That's also what it feels like. Okay, so we know a little bit about your background, but can you share a little bit more about your work, your role, and your career experience?
Sure. So I didn't actually start at AOL as a programmer. I started in customer service doing tech support. So it was supposed to be a summer job between my freshman and sophomore year of college. And it was so much fun. And the people there I lived a very sheltered life growing up. My parents were very conservative in the military. And they have this saying in customer service that if you're too freaky to work retail, you work tech support. So I was not, but I was around all these new interesting people. And I'm like, this is way more interesting than school. So I stuck around. This is about the time Netscape was taking off and the web was this shiny new toy and no one really knew what to do with it. And I fell in love with building stuff for it. So I was self-taught, taught myself HTML. And eventually AOL was like, hey, this web thing is taking off. Does anyone, in the company know how to build web stuff? And I was like, oh, I do. And that started my professional web development career. I moved to Northern Virginia and became the first web developer in my group. And just sort of grew along with the web. It was super exciting. And then many years later, I got the startup bug, and that's when we moved to Savannah. I was the CTO of a little startup called Music Intelligence Solutions. Became the CEO for a minute, and then we ran out of money. So I've crash landed a startup that I don't recommend it. It's not fun. And then I was the president at Rails Machine, where I helped a bunch of other startups scale their web apps. And then I was a CTO at Planted, where we built a really cool recruiting platform. And then COVID killed recruiting. So I joined this company called Outvote that does relational outreach for political campaigns and progressive organizations. So help them scale ahead of the 2020 election. And that was insane. It was like the first time in my life where we had to like worry about state actors. Like the Russians might find us interesting and want to like hack us. And so we had to do like lots of crazy security stuff. And then Gusto came calling and we used Gusto at Outvote. And I'm like, it was just the first like employee portal thing that felt friendly and like wanted you to use it, unlike ADP or some of the other ones where it's like everything is a chore. So yeah, I've been here since last June and I love it.
And I can say we use Gusto too. And I think that might have something to do with you working there and us finding out about it. I don't know, but it is really great. Highly recommend for small businesses or whatever size business, I guess. I don't know. Is it, so do they work with larger companies too, or is it mainly people that are?
Yeah, we say up to 500 employees with benefits. Past that, you usually want really custom things that we don't do.
Cool. Yeah, well, we love it.
We don't do yet.
Well, we love it. So, okay. So thanks for sharing that. Now I kind of want to know, with the switch to remote work for a lot of people, I think a lot of people kind of got this taste of what working remotely like, and I can think of some of the advantages of working in the tech industry. To me, that's a big one. But can you share some of the top reasons to work for a tech company?
I mean, there are as many types of tech company as there are types of other companies. I think one of the reasons to go, I put companies in three buckets, right? There are technology companies where technology is the core of what they do, and they feel like technology is the sort of their advantage. And then there are companies with technology, and they usually think of all technology as IT. So like bigger companies, and they're like, well, we need to innovate, but they have no idea how. So they are companies that either acquire technology and then have an IT department. And then there are companies who don't understand the value. And so like, we'll ignore the other two. Companies with technology at the core, the pace is usually faster. It kind of doesn't matter which department it is. Things are a little more creative. They're a little not seat of your pants, but pretty close. Like there's a lot of experimentation. You are allowed and encouraged to take, reasonable risks, where I think a lot of older, more structured companies are less likely to take risks and punish people who sort of stick their head out of the hole and propose something crazy and new. At tech-centric companies, that's not the case. And if it like, you can sort of feel when they'll cross this line of like you're close to going public or you've gone public, and like the appetite for risk just goes way down. Yeah. And that's when it's time to go find another company, because there's plenty of companies out there that are way more fun. And I think there's a ton of opportunity for growth, no matter what the size of the tech company. Internal movement, like at a small startup, which is where I've spent a lot of time in the second half of my career, everyone kind of has their hands in everything. So like at every little startup, like the marketing and support people are in the product meetings. And so some of that can't help but rub off. And, like we had our marketing person at Music Intelligence ended up becoming the product manager because she really loved it and ended up, managing our Kanban board and gathering requirements and all kinds of stuff. So there's a ton of opportunity for overlap and, learning other disciplines and then switching and doing them. You can try on a ton of different roles, where at more traditional companies, that's not always possible.
Okay. So and maybe this is going to be different based on whether you're working at a startup or you're working at, in the IT department, or a more established startup, I guess. So what is the starting salary for somebody who's, out of school or boot camp or whatever, who wants to program?
That's a really hard question to answer because it depends on where your startup is, the maturity of the start, like size and sort of headquarters. So like it can go, if you're working for a local Savannah tech company and you're a junior developer, starting salary is probably in the 45 to 50,000 range, I would guess. I'm a little out of touch with the local hiring scene at the moment because COVID. And other startups, it's 75, 80. If you have a CS degree, it's closer to 100. But out of a boot camp at a larger startup or a publicly traded company, it's probably 75 to 80 as a start.
Okay.
And that's remote. That's either remote or like you'd have to move to Atlanta or San Francisco or somewhere else.
Okay. So, okay, going back to you're new to programming and you're just starting out. So what are those challenging parts of being a programmer or developer?
It's like learning a foreign language. You've got to immerse yourself in it. It's not something you can do an hour at a time and hope. That's a great way to make it a hobby. Like it's not going to become a career if you can only spend an hour at a time on it. I think the hardest part is balancing like your current job with the job that you aspire to, and making the time to really invest in learning all of that stuff. It's why, like, if you're thinking about a boot camp, the math is, do I have more money than time? If you have more money, then a boot camp is a great way to sort of compress the time needed to get those foundational skills. But if you have more free time than money, then all the stuff to learn those foundational skills is available online. So I think the biggest challenge, the other challenges are sort of inherent to being a programmer. It's really frustrating. Like you have to be willing to fail and fail a lot before it's like this cycle of I have a problem, I'm working on a solution, the solution doesn't work, the solution doesn't work, the solution doesn't work. Yay, it works. And now I'm on to the next thing, which is, oh, I have a new problem and now my solution doesn't work. So it's hours and hours of frustration followed by minutes of success. And then you're on to the next, frustration. So it's, you've got to really love that process and embrace being terrible at something. Like I spent all morning arguing with JavaScript about why my tests were failing. But I'm cheerful. I'm here because that's just the thing. And you just sort of come to enjoy the process of going from sucking and not knowing not even knowing why something is broken to, oh, this is why it's broken. And then, oh, it's fixed. And now I can move on. And it's like the little dopamine hits of, yay, I did a thing, before you move on to the, soul crushing, mess of failing and being terrible at things again.
I hear this most often, that if you're interested in coding, you should love problem solving and learn to be patient because you're not going to figure it out like that. Another thing that I think this might be a misconception. I think we've talked about this before, but people say, well, you got to love math. And I feel like it depends on what type of coding you're doing, right? Like if you're doing more of this statistic side of coding, right? Like that's like a data scientist, probably need to be good at some statistics and math. But what is your take on that in your experience?
I'm not great at math. I let computers do math for me. And like every computing problem breaks down to math in the end. But thankfully, like we have so many layers of abstraction between the CPU running binary and the thing that I write in my text editor that you don't need to know the math really for 90% of everyday sort of full stack web development problems. If you're doing data science, yeah, you should like understand the fundamentals of linear algebra and all of that stuff that I don't know very well. We should get, Kevin DeWalt to do the next one. He can talk about machine learning. It's really logic. Like you have to break down a large sort of conceptual problem into component pieces that are solvable with code and be able to implement those in a way that works and is repeatable and testable. And that's the hard part. It's like, the how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? It's like, how do you solve a big problem? It's one small problem at a time. And like the ability to break down a large problem logically into component small problems that you can solve is super important. If you can't do that, then it's not going to work and you're going to be stuck being really frustrated staring at big problems.
Got it. Okay, so you talked a little bit about this, and not to jump around too much, maybe I don't know if you have any more to say, but you worked at startups, and so what are the advantages, disadvantages to working for a startup as opposed to a more well-established company? Maybe in that, I guess that IT department, that might be the well-established company. Can you kind of explain that, the advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them.
Hard to narrow down. That was
yeah,
a good question. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think it's funny. I loved my time in both, like for different reasons. And I think the advantages of a startup, you will learn a lot very quickly by force. Like you have to learn things quickly. You have to be able to jump in to things that you don't understand or know the first thing about and come up with a solution because there's no one else that's going to do it. And that's an advantage if you like that. Like if you really love being the hero, you get many opportunities to do that at a startup. If you are really curious about how business works and you've never really run one before, you're much closer to the CEO in a startup with 10 people in it than you are at a company of 3,000. Like we used to like measure influence at AOL by how many people were in between you and the CEO on the org chart. And like the farthest that I was ever away was 18 people. And the closest I ever got was 4 or 5. But at most startups, I'm 1 if I'm not the CEO, or 2 if I'm like at Outvote where I was the lead engineer. I reported to the CTO who reported to the CEO. And like I was in the room when a lot of decisions got made. And you get to see the process, you get to see sort of, I think CEOs, like we just have this like, well, I guess now it's sort of a negative opinion of most of them, but like it's just this like, what do they even do? Like at AOL, I was like, what does the CEO even do other than like make me miserable because they go and buy the wrong company or say something stupid to the press that makes my life difficult? But at a startup, it's like, oh, it's really choosing the best of a bunch of bad options for the most part. It's like you have a limited amount of info. You have to make a decision right then. You make the best one that you can at the time and cross your fingers. So like if you are interested in that process, definitely work at a startup. If you want to learn a bunch of different disciplines because you have to, not because you necessarily want to, then startups are great. Disadvantages of startups: the hours are pretty rough. Work-life balance, unless the company is really intentional, like doesn't exist. You just work a lot. I would, at my first startup, I would routinely do 16-hour days.
Wow.
And at other startups, I did that fairly frequently. So like when an 11-hour workday becomes normal and acceptable, like you can't do that forever. And that's why I'm not doing startups now, because I need a break. Other disadvantages, it's just a roller coaster, and it's frequently outside of your I mean, even big companies are outside of your control, but like they're outside of your control at a distance. Like the CEO's far away from you, and the sort of decisions that get made are at a distance. They're not. I didn't feel them as personally as I did bad things that happen in a startup. Frequently they're external, and you don't control your own fate when you're not profitable. Most startups aren't. Like you're just struggling to find product market fit. And so like the day I had to lay everybody off at the music company was a terrible day. It took me years to get over it. That's not something I had to do at AOL. It's not something I'll probably ever have to do at Gusto. And that sucks, but I have that experience. So it's like, yeah, it sucks, but I have the experience, and I can say that I did it. I've also tried to raise money. Like I talked to like funders about investing in my company, and now I can say I have that experience. So like a lot of it's really difficult in the moment. There's a lot of heartbreak involved, like during the beginning of COVID when recruiting stopped, and like I was a CTO, we had to decide like how can we keep going? We got PPE, but it wasn't enough to like keep everybody their full salary. And so it was easier for me to go find a job. So I did. And that was heartbreaking. That was heartbreaking. So like that's the downside. But I think most of the positives sort of, I wouldn't trade them. I think there's like a time in your life when startups make sense, and then there's a time when it doesn't. And that's not free.
Yeah. It makes sense. Startups are, in my experience, working with a lot of different founders or people coming in, they, like you said, are heartbreaking sometimes. And if you've ever had to fire people, that's tough. Like that's really, really hard. And so, and having everybody's, everybody's life kind of and their families underneath your keep is a huge responsibility. So I imagine too, if you're at a startup and you work your way up to over the years in a higher position, there's a lot more to think about too in terms of your seniority. I'm guessing at a company, right? Like how senior do you want to go? I've heard that from some people who say like, I keep getting these really great salary offers, but I don't want to take them because I don't really want the responsibility of what they're asking. I know it's going to change drastically with just like $20,000 more dollars. So I kind of went off topic there, but it made me think about that. Anyway.
I mean, that is a whole other topic. We've got, I think people, thankfully, like I've been doing this for a long time and I still like writing code, but like once people get to my age and have been doing this for this amount of time, a lot of people don't want to code anymore. And it becomes a really difficult career transition if you've not had if you've always been an individual contributor, meaning you just you work sort of, you write code or you do design or whatever, and you don't have any management experience. When you get to this level, you have to you can keep going on the individual contributor route, which is hard because now you're being asked to solve really hard problems, and you're kind of de facto managing people on projects anyway, or you become a manager. And that's scary because you have to sort of give up the day-to-day coding, which is hard. But then you have to deal with people, and people are awful. People are the worst. Like nobody wants to deal with people.
That's why you start coding in the first place. I'm just kidding.
Exactly. But like people don't realize that 99% of coding is just talking to people. Like 90% of my job is coding. I mean, it's not coding. It's talking to people and figuring out what to build and then building it. And it's like, people need to realize that, right? That it's just because you write code and you can make a computer dance and do whatever you want, doesn't mean you don't have to deal with people. You will always have to deal with people because they pay you and they want things from you.
Yeah. That makes sense. I do think that is a misconception, is that like coders just stay behind a computer all day and just shell out code and don't have to interact. I
mean, it was true for a while. Like it was a really interesting transition sort of in the industry to watch. I used to call them trolls, and there was a troll in the dungeon and your developers were trolls in the dungeon, and like to communicate with them, you wrote your request on a piece of paper and slid it under the door, and you never had to see them or talk to them. And like when we started doing web things, like you just need so many other disciplines, and you have to collaborate with designers and product managers and other people in other departments, and like you just can't put up with the trolls anymore. They're just less, like if you can only sling code and you can't like work with other people, your value is just decreased exponentially over the years because it's just a collaborative thing now. You've got to be good at dealing with other people and compromise. Compromise is like number one skill. If you can't do that, you're not going to get very far.
That's a good skill for life in general. Okay, so going back to people who are interested in coding and switching to a tech career, maybe they think, I'm just not a tech person, but I'm so interested in it. How do I go about testing the waters to see kind of what the day-to-day is like, and without investing a lot financially first?
So many companies are remote now, and so many larger companies like Gusto is hiring remote customer service people and remote salespeople and remote marketing people. Get in where you can using your existing skills into a tech company. Like, even if you're a lawyer, like tech companies need lawyers, tech companies need lots of lawyers. So like my suggestion is always don't abandon the skills you've already developed. Like create a hybrid role for yourself, and that usually involves joining a company in the role that role you've already filled somewhere else, so like somewhere that you already have experience, or taking the pay cut and joining in an entry-level position, because internal movement at tech companies is way easier than getting your foot in the door. So if you can get your foot in the door in some other department, you can always move to engineering later. But you might find that there's a role that like is a better hybrid. Like I really wish that more people would look at product management who are interested in tech but like aren't expert coders yet, because product management is sort of this hybrid of project management, logic, dealing with metrics and statistics, and convincing people that this is the thing that we should build. And it's a great job. It's so much fun. And you don't have to know how to code to do it. So like applying for junior product manager positions, applying for customer service, team lead manager roles. Like tech companies are desperate for decent managers because they usually promote engineers, and engineers for the most part make pretty terrible managers. So like we need better managers overall. So like get in where you can, I think, is my biggest recommendation, and use the skills you have. Don't just pretend that you didn't do something before you decided to learn how to code.
It's funny that you bring up product management, because when we were at the last Tech Tuesday with you guys, there was, I don't know if you met him, a guy there who was visiting in town from, I think it was like, it was near Jersey, but he worked for a company that Sling, or not Sling, I don't know why I said Sling, Ring. Sling is a different company. Ring, the Ring doorbell had, I don't know if they acquired it. I think basically they weren't originally Ring, but they were now a part of Ring, I guess, acquired. Yes. And he was a product manager there, and somebody was interested in learning about coding and talking about going to boot camp. And he was like, based on your experience, no, I think you could be a great product manager. Get in there first and see if you like it. Like, you have all this project management experience and working with websites and techies, so why not try this? And I think it's something that a lot of people don't know about, and it's different from project manager, right? Like a product manager and project manager don't always do the same thing. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, that's very much true. And it sort of depends on the company. Smaller companies, product managers kind of do both roles. They do project manage and product manage, but yeah, product management is a distinct career and is super great. I've done it several times and love it. It's hard, but it's fun.
That's exactly what he said. It's challenging, but it's like, he loved it. He absolutely was in love with it. So, okay. So going back to coding from a hiring perspective, so what are your general thoughts on hiring individuals straight out of coding boot camps? Because I've heard different perspectives on this. So say somebody does invest, can you talk a little bit about that and what they should expect after graduating?
Oh, this is such a hard question to answer because I like to be positive for the most part, but expect more rejection than you're used to, because like there's so many boot camps now, and I think that a lot of hiring managers, especially at startups, are just inundated with a bunch of boot camp grad resumes, and they all look the same, and so they all sort of end up in the no pile. This comes down to choosing your boot camp. Like, make sure that the boot camp that you choose has relationships with tech companies that will hire graduates. Talk to other graduates of the program, and if the boot camp doesn't want you talking to graduates, that's a bad sign. So like, it's make sure that you choose a boot camp that does placement as well as teach you some stack. Like, and your best bet, I think, is still that hybrid role. Is like, I've seen way too many boot camp grads that leave out their previous experience and just put like the 3 projects they did in boot camp. It's like, no, that's not like, that's, put your whole experience on there. Give people an idea of the journey that you've taken, and then apply to larger companies. Don't apply to like 10 people, 20 people startups. Go for 100-person plus tech companies, because they'll have the infrastructure to support you and are more willing to take a risk on boot camp grads, where every seat at a small company, you can't like pay someone on potential. You've got like, you have to deliver. And I think the bootcamp grads that I've seen go right into a small startup end up with a lot of bad habits learned from just trying to get something done. Like, there's not a lot of mentorship. You need to go somewhere where there's mentoring, where there's an opportunity to pair with people, and build your foundations. Because just because you come out of a boot camp does not mean you're ready to be a professional programmer. Like, there's a lot more to it than what you learn in that class.
Yeah, I in talking to someone also at Tech Tuesday, they were talking about basically the challenges now is like, so many people are coming out of the boot camps, like you said, but also they had gone to one where you didn't have to pay the fee until they placed you in a job. Like they found a job for you. You had to find a job first, right? And then you paid the boot camp fees, which I thought was a great model. And that went to show that they did have relationships with tech companies, and they were active, and they had, I guess, like counselors that would go out and work with you and link you up to these tech companies and potential roles. So I thought that was an interesting or a thoughtful perspective on that. And the other thing I've heard too is that certain boot camps focus on certain languages. And I'm just so curious about that, because I was looking up reviews one time of one boot camp, and it was like, this boot camp stinks because they teach this language. If you really want to get a diverse, background, you need to go to this boot camp. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like it depends on what the company is using that you're working for, right? Like I don't know. What are your thoughts?
JavaScript sort of is everywhere now. So like if you've got to start somewhere. Like you shouldn't go to a boot camp that's like, we're going to teach you Python and Ruby and Elixir and C and Java, and JavaScript too, because that's just too much. You'll come out not knowing any of them. This is the hard part of being a full stack developer. And like in the old days, there were front-end developers, and they knew HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which are three very different things. They're almost disciplines unto themselves. And then there were back-end developers that did Java or C++ or C# or whatever. But now everybody, like the boot camps are all like, we create full stack developers, which to me is such a tough hill to climb, to come out of a boot camp after weeks and say you're a full stack developer, when it takes years to really become an expert in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, much less backend frameworks. Whether you're still writing JavaScript, like it's still a totally different world. So I think, if they teach you the front end fundamentals with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, then it's probably okay. Like people need front end developers, but they should throw in some back end language, and it doesn't really matter which one. Like if they do Rails, that's great. If they do Python and Flask, that's great. If they do Node and JavaScript, that's also great, because it builds on what you're learning for the front end. And so I think, yeah, you should be a little bit picky, but anyone saying you shouldn't choose that because they teach X, like usually look at the source. It's usually not someone with a ton of experience.
Got it. Okay. That's good to know. So I think I had a couple more questions, but I think you've kind of already answered them. Another one that maybe we could elaborate on was for those kind of looking to test the waters with coding. We talked about product management, and you talked about how you started at AOL, and I think you said customer support, right?
Yep.
What are some other roles that you could find at a tech company, if there are any, that are not tech background related, but that people could delve into to get their start?
If you've started learning how to code, QA is a great place to get in. If the company has a dedicated quality assurance department, because you'll write some code to like write test harness for things. So that QA is great. A lot of QA also doesn't require you to know how to code at all. It's just, you have to be very detail oriented and be able to find the cracks in software, and there's usually plenty. So like, it's kind of a difficult, weird job to do QA, but I know a lot of people come to programming from customer service and from QA, and then they end up becoming engineers. Pretty much every software company / tech company has the same jobs that everyone else does. So like if you have a sales background, tech companies need salespeople. It's like what I said, just get in where you can. If there's a role that fits your previous experience, get in, and you can internal transfer somewhere else. And and it's usually a nice, stable, well-paying job, and you might have work-life balance where you can then, spend some time learning to code, or they have internal training. Like Gusto has a huge amount of internal training that anyone can take on learning how to code.
Yeah, and I gotta speak on that a little bit. You talked, well, it's not specifically about that, but I look at a lot of the remote companies out there now, and I one reason I've noticed is that remote companies often are remote because they can hire the best talent, and they often offer very attractive benefits, very attractive salaries, and also that continuing education. And another role that I think you and I were talking about this is the learning and development role that is at a lot of tech companies now. And I mean, it's at every company, but I feel like learning and development is like, you see it everywhere, is these companies are growing and they need somebody who's going to not only onboard people, but keep them satisfied and educated. And anyways, I just thought I'd mention that. And I see it on a lot of remote job boards specifically.
Yeah, we have a whole like internal learning team. Other one that just came to mind is technical writing. If you have an English background and are okay, describing technology, technical writing is a big thing, especially at larger companies. You won't find them at small companies, but technical writers, especially when like big SaaS companies that have documentation, they usually have a team of technical writers that sort of maintain that. They don't trust developers to write things that people need to read.
Well, this has been great. I want to leave some time for Q&A. But before we do that, can you tell us what's the best way for people to get in touch with you or get involved with TechSav?
TechSAV, go to techsav.co. To reach me, email is great. I love emails. Kevin at techsav.co will work, or Kevin at Lawver.net